for my Uncle Vernon, my mom, and for my grandma, who would be outraged and hurt.
Picture this. It's late 1977. Elvis Presley has been dead for a few months. The world has already cried its tears, held its vigils, bought its memorial records. The news cycle has moved on. The fans have gone home. The entourage has scattered to the four winds. And inside Graceland, that enormous white-columned mansion on Elvis Presley Boulevard that once shook with music and laughter and the electric chaos of the greatest entertainer who ever lived, there is almost total silence. And walking through that silence, moving slowly through those rooms filled with his son's furniture, his son's trophies, his son's clothes still hanging in the closets, is Vernon Presley. Not Elvis, not a legend, not a king. Just a father, a 61-year-old man with a bad heart, a shattered spirit, and nowhere else in the world he knew how to be. That image, that one quiet, devastating image, is where this story really begins. Not at Sun Studio in 1954, not at Madison Square Garden, not at the Vegas residencies or the movie sets or the sold-out stadiums. It begins in the silence after all of that, in the space that Elvis left behind, in the grief that nobody talked about because the world was too busy mourning the son to notice what was happening to the father. And what was happening to Vernon Presley in those months, and in the 2 years that followed, is one of the most heartbreaking and least told stories in the entire history of American music. So let's tell it. To understand what Vernon lost when Elvis died, you first have to understand what Vernon's life actually was before that. Because here's the truth about Vernon Presley that most people don't fully reckon with. This was not a man with a rich, layered identity outside of being Elvis's father. This was not a man who had built his own career, his own circle, his own independent sense of who he was in the world. Vernon Presley's life was Elvis, completely, entirely, from the very beginning. He grew up poor, genuinely poor, the kind of poor that leaves a mark on a person that money can never fully erase. Born in Mississippi in 1916, Vernon spent his early years doing whatever work he could find: farm labor, odd jobs, a stretch in the Mississippi State Penitentiary in his 20s for check fraud that haunted him quietly for the rest of his life. He wasn't a bad man. He was a desperate man in a desperate time, and those are two very different things. But that early hardship shaped everything about how he would later cling to the stability that Elvis provided. Because when Elvis started making money, real money, the kind of money that the Presley family had never in their wildest dreams imagined, Vernon didn't step back and build something of his own. He stepped closer. He became indispensable to his son in the most deliberate way he knew how. He became the man who handled the money, the man who signed the checks, managed the payroll, watched the finances, questioned the expenses. Colonel Tom Parker handled the star-making machinery. Vernon handled the real-world details that kept the machine running on the ground. And Elvis trusted him completely. Whatever you say about their relationship, and it was complicated like all real relationships are, Elvis Presley trusted his father with everything. His money, his business, his home, his future. When Elvis bought Graceland in 1957, Vernon and Gladys moved in. When Gladys died in 1958, Vernon stayed. When Elvis went to the army, Vernon held down the fort. When Elvis came back, Vernon was still there. Through all the marriages, the albums, the movies, the comebacks, the concerts, the chaos of fame, Vernon was there. Not always in the spotlight, not always doing the right thing, but there. And that proximity, that lifelong, unbreakable proximity to his son, became the entire architecture of Vernon's existence. It wasn't just love, though the love was real. It was identity, purpose, the reason Vernon Presley got up in the morning. So what happens to a man like that when the reason disappears? August 16, 1977. Elvis Presley is found unresponsive at Graceland and pronounced dead at Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis. He is 42 years old, and in one afternoon, the entire structure of Vernon Presley's life collapses without warning. People who were there in the immediate aftermath described Vernon's grief as something almost primal. When he was brought to the hospital to identify his son, the sound he made was described as unlike anything anyone in the room had ever heard from a human being. This wasn't quiet, dignified sorrow. This was a man whose entire world had just been ripped out from underneath him, and he didn't have the kind of emotional foundation, or frankly, the life experience, to absorb that kind of blow with any kind of grace. He had already buried Gladys, his wife, the love of his life. Back in 1958, when she died at just 46, Vernon had been devastated in a way that Elvis himself had mirrored almost identically. both men broken open by the same loss. But he had survived that. He had survived it because Elvis was still there, because life still had a center of gravity. Now that center was gone, and the grief didn't process the way grief is supposed to, the way therapists talk about it, in clean stages with some functional recovery on the other end. For Vernon, the grief seemed to simply settle in and stay, like it moved into Graceland right alongside him and made itself at home. Here's what people don't talk about enough: the aftermath of a death like Elvis's isn't just emotional. It's logistical. It's relentless and administrative and brutal. And Vernon, broken and barely functioning, was the one who had to handle it. Because Elvis had named him executor of his estate. Think about what that meant in practical terms. Vernon, a man who was simultaneously drowning in personal grief, had to manage the financial and legal architecture of one of the most complex celebrity estates in American history. The debts, the assets, the ongoing business decisions. The estate was not in perfect shape when Elvis died. There were serious financial pressures, serious questions about what was owed to whom, and what the future of the Presley brand would look like. And it all landed on Vernon. He did it, that needs to be acknowledged. Despite everything, despite the grief, the health problems, the emotional devastation, Vernon Presley showed up and did the work. He made the decisions. He protected his granddaughter Lisa Marie's inheritance with the ferocity that only a grandfather with nothing left to lose could manage. He pushed back when he needed to push back. He kept the estate from collapsing entirely in those fragile first months. But it cost him enormously. And through all of it, through the grief and the paperwork and the legal battles and the quiet unraveling, Vernon stayed at Graceland. He could have left, that's the thing people don't realize. He didn't have to stay in that house. He had options, resources. He could have found somewhere smaller, somewhere that didn't carry the weight of every memory, somewhere that didn't still smell like his son. He could have gone anywhere. He stayed. He kept Elvis's room exactly as it was, untouched, like a shrine or maybe just like a place he wasn't ready to close the door on yet. He walked those halls that used to be full of people, the Memphis Mafia, the musicians, the hangers-on, the family, and he walked them mostly alone now. The people who had filled that house during Elvis's life had lives of their own to get back to. Priscilla was in Lowe's Angels. Lisa Marie was young and being cared for. The entourage had no patron to orbit anymore. The house emptied, and Vernon filled the silence the only way he knew how, by staying present in it, by refusing to leave. Why would a man choose to live inside the monument to his own grief, rather than walk away from it? Because Graceland wasn't just Elvis's house. It was the physical proof that the Presleys had made it. That a poor kid from Tupelo and his hardscrabble father had climbed so far from nothing that they ended up owning a mansion in Memphis. It was the dream made concrete. And as long as Vernon stayed inside those walls, some part of the dream was still alive. Or maybe he just couldn't figure out who he was without those walls around him. Either way, Vernon Presley had made his choice. He was staying. And the loneliness that came with that choice, the profound, suffocating loneliness of a man living alone inside someone else's legend, was only just beginning to close in. There's a version of Graceland that the world knows, the one you can buy a ticket to, the one with the guided tour and the velvet ropes and the audio narration that walks you through the jungle room and the trophy hall and the meditation garden where Elvis is buried. That Graceland is curated, polished, preserved in amber. Every piece of furniture exactly where it was, every gold record on the wall, every inch of it designed to make you feel like Elvis just stepped out for a moment and might be back any second. But there was another Graceland, one that existed before the tickets and the tour groups, one that only a handful of people ever actually saw or lived inside. The Graceland of late 1977 and 1978 and 1979, when the king was gone and his father was still there. That Graceland was something else entirely. And understanding what it actually felt like to be inside those walls during that period, what the atmosphere was, what the daily reality looked like, is the only way to truly understand what Vernon Presley's final years cost him. So let's go inside. Start with the sound, or more precisely, the absence of it. Because Graceland during Elvis's life was never quiet. That's the thing people forget. This was not a peaceful, contemplative household. It was a circus, a commune, a command center, and a party venue all rolled into one. Elvis kept unusual hours, famously nocturnal, often awake until dawn, sleeping through the morning, and the house ran on his schedule, which meant the house was alive at 3 in the morning. Music playing, people talking, food being cooked in the kitchen at midnight, laughter echoing through those big rooms at hours when the rest of Memphis was asleep. The Memphis Mafia, the group of friends and associates and yes-men and genuine loyalists who surrounded Elvis for most of his adult life, were a constant physical presence. These were men who lived at Graceland or near it, who traveled with Elvis, who filled every room: Marty Lacker, Red West, Sonny West, Charlie Hodge, Joe Esposito, Jerry Schilling. At any given moment, some combination of these men were around, and with them came energy, noise, movement, life. And then August 16th happened, and almost overnight that world evaporated. The Memphis Mafia had no reason to stay. No patron, no paycheck, no gravitational center to orbit. Some of them, particularly Red and Sonny West, had already been fired by Elvis the year before, a painful falling out that never fully healed before Elvis died. Others drifted, got jobs, got lives, moved on with the particular awkward grief of people who had dedicated years to a man and now had to figure out who they were without him. They didn't abandon Vernon out of cruelty. They left because there was nothing left to stay for. And the house went quiet. Vernon rattled around inside that silence in ways that people who visited him in those months found deeply unsettling. This was a big house, over 17,000 square feet across the property, rooms branching off rooms, a basement den, a racquetball court that Elvis had built in his final years, sprawling grounds that required a full staff just to maintain. During Elvis's time, that size was swallowed up by the people and the energy that filled it. Now it just felt like an enormous, echoing monument to absence. Staff still came and went. Graceland required maintenance regardless of grief, but the social fabric was gone. The informal drop-ins, the spontaneous gatherings, the sense that something interesting might happen at any moment, that Elvis might suddenly decide everyone was going to the movies at midnight or renting out a fairground for a private party, all of that was over. What replaced it was routine, maintenance, obligation. And Vernon moving through it all like a man who had lost the map. People close to him during this period described him as hollowed out, present in body but somewhere else entirely in spirit. He would sit in rooms for long stretches without much purpose. He kept to a limited circuit of the house, his own bedroom, certain common areas, the kitchen. There were entire wings he rarely entered, rooms that held too much or simply required too much energy to confront. Elvis's bedroom stayed locked. That decision to keep that door closed and that room exactly as it was said everything about where Vernon's head was. He wasn't processing the loss and moving through it toward some kind of acceptance. He was preserving it, holding the moment still. Like if he left that room untouched long enough, he could somehow keep the reality of what had happened at arm's length. Grief in the absence of structure or support does strange things to people. It warps time. It creates rituals that look irrational from the outside but feel like survival from the inside. For Vernon, Graceland itself became the ritual. Staying there, maintaining it, keeping it exactly as Elvis had left it, that was how he coped. Or tried to. Now let's talk about Priscilla, because her name needs to come up here, and it needs to come up honestly. Priscilla Presley had been out of Graceland's daily orbit for years by the time Elvis died. The divorce had been finalized in 1973. She was in Lowe's Angels, building a life, her relationship with Mike Stone, later her acting career, her own slow construction of an independent identity after years of being defined entirely as Elvis's wife. None of that is inherently wrong. People move on after divorces. People rebuild. But the effect of her absence on the post-Elvis Graceland dynamic is worth stating plainly. There was no co-parenting partnership operating out of Memphis. There was no extended family infrastructure closing ranks around Vernon to make sure he wasn't drowning alone in that house. Lisa Marie was young, 9 years old when Elvis died, and she was primarily with Priscilla in California. Which meant Vernon's access to his granddaughter, the last living piece of his son, was limited by geography and circumstance. He loved Lisa Marie fiercely. Everyone who knew the family confirms that, but she wasn't there. And the people who might have created some kind of community or support structure around Vernon were largely elsewhere. So he was, in the most functional sense of the word, alone. And his body knew it. Vernon Presley had been dealing with serious heart problems for years before Elvis died. This was not a man in robust physical health going into the grief. He had already had cardiac episodes, already been through the particular terror of a body that signals its own fragility. He was on medications. He was under doctor's orders to manage his stress and his activity levels. Stress and grief, of course, paid no attention to doctors' orders. The months following Elvis's death saw Vernon's health decline in ways that were visible to anyone around him. He aged, not metaphorically, physically, visibly. The weight of what he was carrying showed up on his face, in his posture, in the slowness of his movements. People who had known him during Elvis's life and saw him in the year after reported the difference like a shock. He looked like a different man, an older man, a man whose body was surrendering something it couldn't get back. His doctors were concerned. Those around him were concerned. But Vernon was not a man who had ever prioritized his own well-being over everything else. His entire adult life had been organized around other people's needs, primarily Elvis's. The idea of taking care of himself as an end in itself was almost foreign to him. So he pushed through, kept managing the estate, kept showing up, kept walking those quiet halls. But Graceland slowly was becoming something it had never been before. It was becoming a weight. A beautiful, irreplaceable, suffocating weight. The house that Elvis had bought as a symbol of everything the Presley family had overcome, the poverty, the struggle, the years of nothing, was now the place where Vernon's grief lived and grew and took up more space with each passing month. He had built his life inside these walls, and now the walls were closing in. The man who once stood proudly beside the biggest star in the world was disappearing, quietly and completely, inside the monument his son had left behind. And what came next? The choices Vernon made, the woman who entered his life, and the final deterioration that nobody outside those gates fully witnessed, was going to complicate the Presley story in ways that even the most devoted fans never saw coming. Here's something the polished, packaged version of the Presley story doesn't spend much time on. In the middle of all that grief, in the middle of that cavernous silence inside Graceland, in the middle of a man quietly coming apart at the seams, Vernon Presley fell in love again. Or at least, he found something that felt enough like love that he held on to it with everything he had left. Her name was Sandy Miller, and her arrival in Vernon's life is one of those chapters in the Presley story that gets glossed over, skipped past, treated as a minor footnote in a much bigger narrative. But it wasn't a footnote. It was complicated and human and layered with the kind of messy emotion that doesn't fit neatly into the legend. Because Sandy Miller wasn't just a woman Vernon dated. She was the person he chose to spend his final years with. The person who was inside Graceland when the rest of the world had moved on. The person who was there at the end. And the questions her presence raised, about grief, about timing, about money, about loyalty, about what it means to move on after an unsurvivable loss, are questions that the people closest to the Presley family were asking quietly and urgently, even if they weren't asking them out loud. Vernon met Sandy Miller not long after Elvis died. The exact circumstances have been described in different ways by different people, but what's consistent across all of them is the timeline. This was fast. Uncomfortably fast by most people's standards. Elvis had been gone for months, not years, when Vernon began seeing her. And in a family still raw and reeling from the most public, most devastating loss imaginable, that speed registered. Now, before we judge that too harshly, let's sit with it honestly for a moment. Because grief is not a linear, predictable thing. And loneliness, the specific, crushing loneliness of a man like Vernon, who had never in his adult life been truly alone, who had always had either Gladys or Elvis as the organizing force of his existence. That kind of loneliness can drive people toward connection in ways that look reckless from the outside, but feel like oxygen from the inside. Vernon was not a young man. He was in his 60s. He was in poor health. He was living inside a house full of ghosts, managing a dead man's estate, watching his granddaughter grow up from a distance. The idea that he might reach for human warmth, for companionship, for someone who looked at him and saw Vernon rather than just Elvis's father, that's not hard to understand. But understanding something and being comfortable with it are two different things. And within the Presley orbit, Sandy's presence created a discomfort that simmered quietly beneath the surface of every family interaction in those final years. The questions people asked, and mostly asked in private, were pointed. Who was Sandy Miller before Vernon? What did she want? Why had she moved so quickly into the life of a grieving man who happened to be sitting on one of the most valuable entertainment estates in America? Was she there for Vernon? Or was she there for what Vernon represented, the access, the house, the name, the legacy? Those questions may be unfair. They may be the product of grief-sharpened suspicion rather than any actual wrongdoing on Sandy's part. The people who knew her personally have described her in ways that are genuinely sympathetic. A woman who cared about Vernon, who provided real comfort in an impossible period, who showed up when most people had stopped showing up. But fairness doesn't always survive in the atmosphere of loss and money and legacy. And within the complex emotional ecosystem of what remained of the Presley family after Elvis, Sandy was always going to be viewed with a particular wariness. Vernon married her in July of 1979. A quiet ceremony, nothing like the spectacle that had surrounded any event connected to Elvis's name. Just Vernon making a choice in the time he had left to not be alone. And the timing of that marriage matters, because 1979 was not a good year for Vernon Presley physically, not even close. Let's talk about his health, because by the time Vernon walked Sandy down the aisle, his body was already deep into a deterioration that everyone around him could see and nobody could fully stop. The heart problems that had been following Vernon for years had accelerated dramatically in the post-Elvis period. This is not speculation or retrospective diagnosis. This is documented, observable, reported by the people who were around him. Grief does physiological things to the human body that medicine has studied and confirmed. Prolonged, intense grief elevates cortisol. It disrupts sleep, appetite, immune function. It puts sustained stress on the cardiovascular system in ways that are particularly dangerous for people who are already compromised. Vernon was already compromised, seriously so. He had undergone heart procedures. He was managing his condition with medication and monitoring. His doctors were not painting an optimistic picture, and yet the demands on him, emotional, administrative, legal, had not decreased in proportion to his declining capacity. He was still the executor of Elvis's estate. He was still making consequential decisions about Lisa Marie's inheritance, about the financial future of everything Elvis had built. He was still the person that various parties looked to when questions needed answers. The weight of that responsibility on a body and a spirit that were both running on empty is almost impossible to overstate. People who saw Vernon in 1978 and into 1979 described a man who was visibly fatting. Not just emotionally, though that was obvious too, but physically. He moved more carefully. He tired more easily. The sharp, watchful energy he'd had during Elvis's life, the particular alertness of a man who had spent decades managing a superstar's business affairs, was dulling. He was still present, still engaged, but the light behind his eyes had changed. And inside Graceland, in those months before his death, the atmosphere had shifted again. Sandy was there, which meant Vernon wasn't alone in the physical sense anymore. But the emotional terrain was still devastatingly complicated. A new wife in the house that Elvis built. A new dynamic in the rooms that still held every trace of the sun. A new chapter beginning in a story that felt, to Vernon himself, like it had already ended. Lisa Marie was 11 years old when Vernon died. Old enough to sense the complexity around her grandfather's new marriage, young enough that the full weight of what was happening was still beyond her grasp. Her relationship with Sandy was not warm. That much has been noted in various accounts over the years, without much elaboration. But what it tells us is that the human geography of Graceland in Vernon's final period was fragile, layered, and far from the unified family portrait that the Presley public image always suggested. Priscilla, watching from California, had her own feelings about all of it, feelings she managed, as she managed most things, with a careful public composure that revealed very little. But the presence of a new woman in Vernon's life, in Graceland's life, in the orbit of the estate she had once been central to, that was not a neutral development. Nothing inside the Presley ecosystem was ever fully neutral. And Vernon, caught at the center of all of it, the grief, the new marriage, the declining health, the estate responsibilities, the family tensions, had very little room left to simply be a human being who was dying. Because that is what was happening. Vernon Presley was dying. And the cruelest part of it was how quietly it was happening, how little attention the world was paying, how thoroughly his deterioration was being conducted in private, while the public narrative about the Presley family remained fixed on Elvis. Always Elvis, forever Elvis. On June 26, 1979, Vernon Presley died of heart failure in Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis. The same hospital where they had taken Elvis less than 2 years before. He was 63 years old. The official cause was cardiovascular. His heart, which had been struggling for years, finally gave out. But the people who had watched him in those final 22 months, who had seen the hollowing out, the withdrawal, the way the grief had settled into his bones and refused to leave, those people carried a different understanding. Not a medical one, a human one. Vernon Presley had lost his son, and then he had spent every day since trying to find a reason to stay and running out of reasons faster than he was running out of time. Was it heart failure? Yes, technically, clinically, officially, yes. But there are people who knew Vernon Presley, who sat with him in those quiet Graceland rooms, who watched him walk those halls alone, who saw what the loss of Elvis actually did to a man who had nothing else. And those people will tell you something different. They'll tell you that Vernon Presley's heart didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because it was broken, completely and irreparably broken. And no surgeon, no medication, no new marriage, no amount of staying busy with a state business, nothing was ever going to fix that. He didn't die 2 years after his son. He died the same day. It just took his body a little longer to catch up. They buried Vernon Presley at Graceland. Right there on the property, in the meditation garden beneath the trees, alongside Gladys and alongside Elvis. The family that had started with nothing in Tupelo, Mississippi, that had scratched and struggled, and somehow, impossibly, ended up owning one of the most famous private residences in the world, was reunited in that garden in a way that felt, depending on how you looked at it, either deeply poetic or quietly devastating. Poetic because they were together again, the three of them, the original unit, the mother who sacrificed everything, the father who held on through everything, and the son who changed everything. Back together in the ground they had worked so hard to own. Devastating because Vernon was 63, because he should have had decades left, because the man who buried his wife and then buried his son was now himself being buried, and the speed of it all, Gladys in 1958, Elvis in 1977, Vernon in 1979, told a story about what loss does to a family when it comes too fast and too hard for any human being to absorb. 3 graves in that garden, 3 members of a family that the whole world thought it knew. And yet standing at Vernon's grave, you have to ask yourself, how well did the world actually know him? How much attention did anyone really pay to the man behind the legend, the father behind the king? The honest answer is not much, not nearly enough. Here is what Vernon Presley actually did that history tends to skip over. He was the one who took a teenage Elvis to audition at Sun Studio. He was the one who signed the recording contract because Elvis was still a minor and couldn't sign it himself. He was the one who managed the financial scaffolding of the entire Elvis operation during the years when Colonel Parker was handling the spectacle and someone still needed to make sure the lights stayed on and the bills got paid.